people do ask this. They say,
Yeah.
well, we know that we can, there's evidence now for changing the brain, and we talk about the mind changing the brain. What does all that mean? And what is the mind? And what is the brain? And what are the difference between the two?
Yeah, that's a profound question, and I think it occupies people. And people use the word mind differently, and just as long as we know how the word is being used, that's fine. In the framework of neuroscience and neuropsychology, generally speaking, which, as you know, occurs inside what's called the natural frame, in terms of things are seen as natural processes rather than supernatural or divinely directed processes. In other words, it's, for example, in history, things that initially seemed supernatural, like lightning or the changes of the seasons, were presumed to have supernatural causes, but over time we come to appreciate that lightning is not due to Jupiter or Zeus, sending bolts down from the sky. It's an electrical process, between the clouds and the earth, essentially. And we understand the changes of the seasons are due to the earth going around the sun. It's not that God's finger is pushing the earth around the sun. Okay. So in the same way, in neuroscience, mind is considered to be essentially the information that's represented by the nervous system. And that may sound kind of esoteric, but we're surrounded by daily examples of non-physical, immaterial meanings, signals, instructions, programs, concepts being represented by some kind of material substrate. For example, the meaning of the sounds we're uttering here, the meaning is not physical, but the sound waves, or through the wonders of Skype, however they do it in the internet, the electromagnetic waves that represent the sounds that we're making here, those are material, including in the sense of E equals mc squared. Energy and matter are part of materiality. So if you think about the material shapes of letters that constitute words that become sentences and paragraphs and books, those shapes are material, but they represent non-physical, immaterial information. So if you scale that up in the nervous system, there's a ton of information flowing around, most of which is forever unconscious. The instructions that are being sent to the heart to keep it beating at a certain pace, the information flowing up into the brain about the oxygen saturation in the blood, or the CO2 saturation actually, which would then lead us to take a deeper breath. If that CO2 saturation rises above a little level, and a little monitor, trips a signal that tells the brain, breathe a little more deeply. All that is information, if you think about it. And then scaling it up further, we have the information of hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, and smelling. And then, of course, thinking, feeling emotions, wanting, longing, enjoying, pain, pleasure, all the rest of that. That territory is what neuroscientists essentially mean by mind. It's the realm of experience. And I think that animals have experiences. For example, all animals sleep. They have including insects, they have their version of sleep. And in other words, there's a transition between consciousness and unconsciousness. Cats, I think, clearly are conscious. And so I think if we think in terms of animals especially, we can get that there are experiences that are occurring. These experiences are not physical. You can't touch your experience. But it's presumed inside the natural frame that those experiences must involve some kind of underlying physical processes. It's possible that a transcendental or supernatural X factor is required. Personally, I am a transcendentalist. I think there are X factors. That said, inside the natural frame, it's clear that most, if not all, mental activity, hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, wanting, subtleties of mindfulness, longings of various kinds, all that must require some kind of underlying physical activity. Because if you change the physical activity, if you give somebody a drug, or you bang on their head, in a football accident, playing rugby or something like that, you change the physical substrates, you change the mind itself. Okay, so in this context then of this one-to-one matching, or co-patterning, co-arising of patterns of information represented by patterns of underlying neural activity, patterns of mentality, represented by patterns of materiality, the two co-arising, they go together. This means that any kind of mental activity entails neural activity. Repeated mental activity entails repeated neural activity. Aha! Repeated neural activity leaves lasting traces in neural structure. That's how repeated mental activity leaves lasting changes in neural structure, right? And that's maybe a needlessly complex explanation, but it really bottom lines it, because it helps you appreciate that while much mental activity does not leave a lasting trace, negative mental activity that we are identified with, hijacked by, rather than mindfully witnessing, leaves traces very rapidly. That's the negativity bias. That's the Velcro of the brain. The brain is very sponge-like for the negative experiences, whereas positive patterns of mental activity need to be sustained for their underlying neural substrates to be strengthened.
So what you're saying is that the brain is the embodiment of it's the actual physical structure that allows the mind to work, but as the mind has choices as to where it places its focus.
That's correct.
And
I like Dan Siegel's line. He says the mind uses the brain to make the mind. I think that's a really nice summary, essentially. And I think people get caught up in all kinds of twists about mind, brain, And, for one, I honestly think that a full account of the causes, I think at this point, I think there's a fairly full account of the causes of the Earth moving around the sun, including Einstein's formulation of how the great mass of the sun bends space-time. So the Earth keeps orbiting the sun, in effect, like a marble going around a sink, that's bent or shaped. Anyway, I think we are a century or two or three. I think it could well be a few centuries before we have a full account of human consciousness. And it could well be that we realize that there are necessarily there must be X factors, because natural causes cannot, for some reason, inherently give us a full account of the mind. That'll be a very interesting day, if that day should come. But meanwhile, I think I'm a practical guy. I think that it's fun to play around with this consciousness stuff for a few minutes.
Yeah.
But on the whole, I don't think there's enough information.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're a little bit like the alchemists back in the Middle Ages, who can be skillful, and that we know that if you pour these two liquids that are clear together, they turn bright red. Who knew, right? But we have no idea why, because we don't have a periodic table yet. We don't have an atomic theory, let alone a quantum mechanical theory. So, at the end of the day, it is really clear in tons of animal studies and human studies as well that there's a very tight relationship between mental activity and neural activity. And knowing that, if you know a little bit about the hardware of your brain, including how it learns, you can become more skillful at stimulating the circuitry, the factors, the neurochemical processes that underlie beneficial, positive, wholesome, useful, pro-social states of mind.
Okay.
And by repeatedly stimulating those underlying neural processes, since neurons that fire together wire together, it's called experience-dependent neuroplasticity. By skillful targeting of those underlying processes, you strengthen them. By stimulating them, you strengthen them. And you steepen your learning curve, and you grow more of the good stuff inside yourself as a result.